Nobody saw him come in. That was the first thing that went without explanation that night. The production assistant was still searching through her lists when the man was already standing at the edge of the curtain, still, with an old guitar in one hand and a wooden cane in the other. No badge. No participant number. Nothing that justified his presence there. The audience noticed him before the judges did. The murmur that moved through the theater was not excitement. It was unease. The particular discomfort of people who don't know whether what they're seeing is a mistake or something else entirely. The man was old, very old. White hair cut short, a beard close to his face, dark simple clothing, pressed trousers, a white shirt buttoned to the collar, a black vest that had been ironed with care and still held its shape despite its age. In one hand, the wooden cane. In the other, a round-bodied resonator guitar with a metal cone visible through the cover plate. The kind of guitar they don't make anymore, the kind built to project sound before amplification existed. The kind that looks like it came from the earth rather than a factory. It had been repaired many times, it had never been replaced. His eyes were open but unfocused, aimed slightly upward and to the side in the particular way of someone who has been blind long enough for their eyes to stop pretending to look at things. The judges exchanged glances. Marcus Webb, the eldest of the three, leaned forward. He asked who had let the man through. Nobody had an answer. The production team was already checking cameras, checking logs, checking everything that could be checked. The man had no registration, no appointment, no name on any list. He had simply walked in the way a man walks into a place he has been before, or a place he always knew he would end up. Danny Reeves, the youngest judge, tried to lighten the tension with a comment about the show's format. The man raised one hand, just one, with a calm that silenced the room more effectively than any response could have. Danny's smile faded on its own. Claire Ashworth, the British music journalist who had built a career on never being caught off guard, studied the man with the careful attention of someone who cannot finish reading what she is looking at. She asked him, quietly, what he had come to do. The man lowered his hand. He breathed slowly. When he spoke, his voice filled the theater without effort, as if that space belonged to him in some way nobody could quite explain. He said he hadn't spoken in many years, that he had been carrying things inside him that he never knew how to put into words. That there had always been one way, only one, in which he could say everything he had, and that he had stopped, and that stopping had been killing him from the inside slowly without anyone noticing. Not even himself at first. The theater was very quiet. Someone asked him what that one way was. He looked at the three judges one by one. Playing, he said. It was always playing. The murmur that followed was different from the first one. Less uncomfortable, more curious. The audience was beginning to understand that whatever this was, it was not a mistake. Claire asked the obvious question whether he had played before. Looking at that man with that cane, that clothing, that ancient guitar, the question was inevitable. Something crossed his face. Not offense. Something closer to the quiet irony of a man hearing a question he never expected anyone to ask. He lifted the guitar slightly, the way you lift something when you want to let someone see it properly. He said he had been playing since he was 6 years old, that he had stopped counting after the first 50 years. Marcus Webb had been sitting with his arms crossed since the moment the man walked out. He released them slowly, without noticing. 50 years, he repeated, almost to himself. And then the man had stopped. He asked why. The man held the guitar against his body with the familiarity that only time gives. His fingers found their place without searching. The way you take the hand of someone you have known your whole life. He said it was because the person he played for had died. And that after she was gone, finishing the song he had been making for her felt like closing a door he wasn't ready to close. The silence that followed was different from all the other silences of that night. Danny Reeves looked down at the table. He was 31 years old, and in that moment he felt every one of those years, felt the distance between where he sat and wherever it was that this man was speaking from. He asked who she was. The man was quiet for a moment. His face did something complicated, the expression of someone moving through rooms in a house they know by heart. Her name was May, he said. Some names arrive in a story and you know immediately they are not just names, they are addresses, places where everything that matters is kept. May was that kind of name for Elijah Kane. It had been that kind of name for 60 years. He met her in Clarksdale in 1963. She was 18 and he was 21, and he had been blind for 2 years and was still learning what the world felt like without sight, still mapping everything, still translating everything into the language of sound and touch and temperature that would become his primary way of knowing things. May was the first person who didn't treat his blindness as a tragedy that needed fixing or a limitation that needed managing. She treated it as simply part of the landscape of him. The same way his hands were large, his voice was low, his ability to find a melody in 30 seconds that other musicians spent a week searching for. She loved him plainly and without performance, which is the hardest kind of love to find and the hardest kind to lose. They had 41 years together, a daughter and 2 sons, a house on a street where the trees grew over the road and made a tunnel of shade in summer. Arguments and silences and repairs and the long, ordinary texture of a life so completely shared that the boundary between one person and another becomes more suggestion than fact. May died in 2004. A Tuesday in February, the trees were bare. Elijah Kane had not performed publicly since. The judges learned all of this slowly, in pieces, the way you learn something that is too large to take in all at once. Marcus asked about the song when it had started, why it had never been finished. Elijah told him he had begun it the year he met her, 1963, and that he kept adding to it over the decades, that it was always almost done, that there was always one more thing he wanted to say, one more feeling he hadn't managed to get into the chord changes yet. May used to tell him he was afraid to finish it, because finishing meant admitting he had said everything he had to say about loving her. She was probably right. Claire asked why now, why this stage? Why tonight? He said he'd had a health scare 6 months ago, that he didn't need to go into details, but that it had reminded him of something May told him once, that a song that doesn't get played is just silence with ambition. He had been silence with ambition for 20 years. He thought it was time to be a song. The theater had gone beyond quiet. It had reached that state where the absence of sound becomes a kind of pressure, where you become aware of your own breathing because everything else has stopped competing with it. Marcus Webb then asked about the guitar. It was a National Resonator, a Triolean, from 1931. Elijah's father had gotten it from a man in Greenwood who needed to pay a debt, paid $23 and a week of labor. It had been played every day since his father taught him the first chord. 62 years on Elijah's side alone. Before him, however long his father had it. Before that, whoever had owned it before. Claire said the guitar had more history in it than most museums. Elijah said it had more music in it than he would ever manage to get out, but that he had been trying. Danny asked something that surprised everyone, including himself. He asked how a blind man knows where he is on the fretboard, physically, spatially. Elijah turned toward him with something that might have been appreciation. The same way you know where you are in a room you've lived in for 60 years, he said. You stop thinking about it. Your hands know. Your hands always knew. The thinking is what gets in the way. Then Marcus spoke again, and his voice had changed. The professional register had dropped slightly, something more personal coming through. He said he had grown up in Memphis, that his grandmother had played piano blues, that she used to talk about the musicians she'd seen come through, the ones from the Delta, from Clarksdale, from Greenwood and Indianola. She talked about a blind guitar player who moved through the juke joints up and down, Route 61 inches, the 60s and 70s. She called him the Clarksdale Ghost, because he would appear at a place, play all night, and by morning nobody knew where he had gone. The theater went still. Marcus looked at Elijah Kane and asked if that had been him. Something moved across Elijah's face. The near smile again, but deeper this time. I was never a ghost, he said. I just never stayed long enough to become a regular. Marcus sat back in his chair slowly, like a man absorbing something he wasn't sure he was ready to absorb. He said his grandmother had talked about that musician for 40 years, said he was the best guitarist she had ever heard, and she had heard everyone. She had passed in 2019. Elijah said he was sorry. Marcus said she would have lost her mind to see this. Elijah turned his face upward slightly, toward the lights perhaps, toward whatever he heard in the direction of the theater's ceiling, the hum of the rigging, the air conditioning, the ambient sound of 200 people breathing. He asked for her name. Marcus told him, Della Webb. Elijah nodded slowly, the way you store a name somewhere careful. Then this is for Della too, he said. He didn't ask for permission. He didn't wait for a signal from the judges or a nod from the floor producer or a countdown from the PA system. He simply brought the guitar up to his body the way a man raises something he has raised 10,000 times, and his left hand found the neck and his right hand found the strings, and he began.
I knew every room by the sound of your steps. The floorboards, the glasses, the smoke and the sweat. You'd squeeze my hand when it was time to begin, and I'd find the whole night by the touch of your skin. Lead me home, like you always did. Through the noise, through the dark, through the places I've been. Lead me home, I've been gone too long. This old guitar still remembers, but I don't, since you've been gone. We played in little bars where the neon would shake, for drunks and lost lovers and men wide awake. I never saw their faces, I never saw the light, but I knew I was standing if you were there that night. Lead me home, like you always did. Through the noise, through the dark, through the places I've been. Lead me home, I've been gone too long. This old guitar still remembers, but I don't, since you've been gone. The night they laid you down, I put this guitar away. Couldn't play it to an empty dark that didn't hold your name. A blind man learns a world by what stays and what leaves. And when they took you from me, they took the ground beneath my feet. Tonight I heard your voice in the hum before the crowd, in the grain of this wood, in the trembling of my mouth. So if you're somewhere near, like I pray you are, sit beside me one more time and lead me through the dark. Lead me home, like you always did. Through the noise, through the dark, through the places I've been. Lead me home, I've been gone too long. This old guitar still remembers, but I don't, since you've been gone. No, I don't, since you've been gone.
The silence afterward lasted 11 seconds. Nobody counted, but everyone felt it. It was Marcus who stood first. He rose the way a person rises when standing is not a choice, but a response when the body moves before the decision is made. He stood and said nothing, and his face, which had been carefully composed for 17 years of television, was not composed now. It was open in the way of something that has had its structure removed from the inside. Claire stood immediately after, hands pressed together in front of her face, fingertips at her lips, nodding slowly, the nod of someone confirming something to themselves rather than communicating to anyone else. Danny stood last, and when he did, he exhaled a long breath held too long, the breath of someone surfacing, and then the entire theater rose. The sound was not the sound of a competition being won. It was not the celebratory roar of a successful audition. It was something quieter and larger, the sound of 200 people acknowledging something they had just been given. Something they hadn't expected to receive that evening. Something they would think about later in ways they couldn't predict. Elijah Kane stood at the center of the light and did not move. He held the guitar against his chest and listened to the sound, not the applause exactly, but its specific frequency, its texture, which told him things nobody else in that room could hear. He had played in juke joints where nobody applauded because applause wasn't the custom. He had played on street corners where people dropped coins without stopping. He had played in hospital rooms and on porches and in the living rooms of friends and at the funerals of people who loved to hear him play. He had never played for this. He didn't know what to do with it. He raised one hand. Not a wave, more an acknowledgement, the gesture of a man saying, "I hear you, I receive this, thank you." When the applause finally settled, Marcus spoke, not in the voice he used on television. He told Elijah that what had just happened on that stage was not something any of them were going to forget. Then asked the question the theater had been holding without knowing it. He asked if the song was finished now. Elijah was quiet for a long moment, his hand moving slowly along the body of the guitar. He said he wasn't sure. He had thought that if he played it all the way through, he would know. Maybe it was finished. Maybe a song is finished when it doesn't hurt the same way anymore, only a different way. Before, carrying it hurt because it was incomplete, like a sentence with no period, like holding your breath. Now it hurt because it was done, but that was a different kind of hurt. The kind that means something has been completed, something set down. Danny, who had not tried to hide the tears on his face, said that what he had witnessed was not a performance, that it was something else, that he didn't have the right word for it. Elijah made the near smile again, the one that held more rooms than it showed. The blues always was something else, he said. That's why it lasted. Claire spoke then, with the clarity that had returned to her voice, saying the show had rules but also had something more important than rules, it had memory. And what Elijah had brought to that stage was not just a song, it was a piece of history that had been on the verge of disappearing forever. They couldn't let that happen. Marcus stood from his chair and said Elijah had not come to compete, that he had come to finish something left unfinished, and that they were not the ones to ask him to leave without having finished it. He asked him to continue not as a contestant, but as what he had always been, a musician, a keeper of something irreplaceable. The theater erupted. Elijah took a long time to react, looking toward the judges as if searching their words for some trap, some misunderstanding, then at the standing audience, then at the guitar in his hands. 81 years old, he said quietly, almost to himself. 81 years old, and it's today. From the front row, an older man stood. Nobody knew him. He was simply someone from the audience, but he called out with a clear, firm voice. The blues never dies, and the theater repeated it like an echo that didn't want to stop. He was in a small room backstage when the stage assistant found him, sitting with the guitar across his lap, the cane leaning against the wall beside him, looking at nothing in particular, or at everything only he could see. She sat down across from him and asked how he was. He said, tired, the good kind, the kind where you have spent something you were saving. She asked if she could ask him something, and he said she could ask him anything that he might not answer, but she could ask. She asked if he had been afraid when he walked out onto that stage. He considered it seriously, gave the question the full weight it deserved, and said he had been blind since he was 19, that fear of the dark was a luxury he couldn't afford, that you walk out anyway, that it isn't courage, it's just what's left when you run out of alternatives. She sat with that for a moment, then thanked him for letting them hear. He nodded slowly, turned his face slightly upward the way he did when listening to something nobody else could hear. Thank you for letting me play, he said. Elijah Kane drove back to Clarksdale, Mississippi in the early hours of the following morning. The clip of him standing at the center of the stage before a single note had been played was shared 2 million times in the first week. Not the song. The moment before the song, because anyone who watched understood without being told that they were seeing something being retrieved, something that had been put away for too long being brought back into the light. Musicians across the Delta posted videos playing the melody he had played, most of them not knowing the song's name, most of them not needing to. A man in Memphis, 73 years old, called his son for the first time in 4 years. He didn't mention the show, he just called. In Clarksdale, on a street where the trees made a tunnel of shade in summer, a house sat quiet in the early morning light, and inside, a man with a resonator guitar leaned it carefully against the wall beside his bed. He had said what he needed to say. For now, that was enough. The Blues House would return the following week. There were more stories in the dark, waiting for the light. You have been listening to one of them. My name is Elijah Kane. I am 81 years old. I have been blind since I was 19. And everything I just told you, the lights I couldn't see, the faces I couldn't read, the theater I couldn't watch, filled with people standing, I heard it. I felt it. I mapped it the only way I ever learned to map anything. The same way I always found the music. By feel. If this story reached you, tell us in the comments which part stayed with you. And Subscribe to keep hearing stories that don't ask permission but deserve to be told.